Good evening. Welcome to the Open Lecture Series, which, I have to say this, is this time very special because we have the help of the British Council and Estonian Architecture Center and the Cultural Endowment of Estonia, two lecturers, space popular, Lara Lesmes and Fredrik Hellberg, who are space popular. One thing that I have to kind of interrupt with is that we just realized that this semester we have 3 generations of kind of architects from same school of thought, in a way. Last time we had Christina and Efren from Amit 09, who were tutors of Fredrik and Lara. And in April, we will have Sir Peter Cook, who was tutoring them. So we have kind of 3 generations of people kind of emerging from the Architecture Association, very much still alive and kicking and operating on top of their game. So it's kind of interesting to see. So tonight's lecture, Lara and Fredrik are both graduates from the Architectural Association. And they founded Space Popular in Bangkok in 2013. And since 2016, they relocated to London. And the practice works in multiple scales, from furniture to interior design to architecture, urbanism, and design of virtual worlds. I think it's like from small to kind of the biggest. So they make architecture, products, furniture, graphics, interfaces, and research. The duo have extensive teaching experience at INDA in Bangkok and the Architecture Association, and have lectured and participated as visiting critics internationally. Beyond their academic experience, Space Popular has ongoing and realized built projects and exhibitions in Europe and Asia. Please join me welcoming Fredrik and Lara from Space Popular.
Thank you. 2,500 homes crawling down a hill, forming car-free garden fjords, access through the roof overlooking the Baltic Sea, gifting public hanging gardens to the city of Stockholm.
Hovering over the Kazakh plains, suspended from a forest of space frames, a series of incomprehensibly large domes, clad in shimmering ceramic, house the ceremonial spaces and burial grounds for the national heroes of Kazakhstan, representing all religions.
A forest of columns supporting a bridge structure that houses a museum where each one of its brick arches tells one of the 168 stories written by Hans Christian Andersen.
5 versions of a building, of which only small traces have survived, assemble a reconstructed ruin, virtually augmented in an open park in Warsaw.
A bulbous library on blue legs, a glass barn on the snowy roof, a public living room in Technicolor, and a hotel tower in an ombre dress come together to form a block and not a building, meeting the city at its own scale, bringing back details that once were familiar and others that never were.
A low poly forest, glowing from within, becomes one with the treetops while clearly being an alien to it. Is a hat for infrastructure, with no public access, only visually accessible from the car, remotely inhabited by our minds.
A wooden structure reminiscent of 19th century grand villas, and a cyclopean masonry plinth, mediated by a steel octet truss, present the metaphorical image of the fascinating and complex Hilma af Klimt, and while housing her works, provide spaces of leisure in various forms.
An impossibly thin metal structure, irregularly filled with rooms, covered by shallow brick vaults, accommodating local construction techniques and climate. In the tradition of brick vault master Rafael Guastavino, completely without scaffolding or formwork, to provide a home for anybody.
An interior ornamental system of mirror, alloy, and wood creates a number of different spaces that translate ideology into atmosphere.
A concrete shop house turned into a cloudscape. Muted spaces where the function is only revealed by furniture.
From urban to furniture design at all scales, our aim is to provide experiences that learn from how we perceive and how we behave, and are lived and constructed in the human mind. When a client asks you to design a spa, he or she is not only asking for a layout, but for a wholesome experience, where all elements come together, where all details are considered, where space is built for you and around you.
In practice and in teaching, we are driven by two guiding notions: that architecture is constructed in the mind, and that architecture is a portal to a new reality.
With these ideas, we are building a practice that engages with the teachings of psychology and neuroscience and embraces new technologies and new ways of inhabiting the world. We believe that architecture is the practice of world making, of creating realities. The idea of making buildings emerged to provide alternative realms to what we call the outdoors. Buildings are the reason why we can make sense of the world outside, because they are the greatest abstraction machine. And such abstractions can be done formally, as we just saw through walls and openings, or symbolically, through components that sensorially communicate and stimulate our minds into alternative, all-encompassing worlds. But these alternative realities are not experienced in isolation. They exist in relation to our world. And that is why this William Morris wallpaper is trying so hard to be an acanthus leaf through its forms and colors, trying to transport us to an alternative outdoors, yet an outdoors that we can recognize. Because architecture is the practice of interconnecting realities, indoors and outdoors, physical and virtual. But what realities should we build? In times past, buildings have represented gateways to heaven, they have embodied empires and power, or provided layouts for life on the basis of political principles, all of them narratives dictated by either religion or politics. But today, these narratives don't seem to be any longer valid. And as our world is being turned upside down, the experience of space seems to be our only stable narrative. If this is the case, then how can spatial experience present narratives? Well, I propose we do a little experiment. That is actually Olgiati's experiment. You should all imagine a room, any room. It's in each of your heads. And now you add a staircase to that room. In doing so, when we add that staircase, we have also planted the idea of a second floor in your head. But now add another staircase to the room. Is there two ways to the second floor? Is there another room in that second floor? Is there yet another floor? In this sense is how we consider that spaces contain narratives, not through sticking a crucifix on the wall and believing that that is God over the altar, but purely through spatial experience and through our previous experience of the world and the expectations that that generates. The reason why we think it is of high priority to deal with the experience of space as a driving force and not as an afterthought is because architecture might be our tool to make sense of the world, might be our last tool. And it might be replacing religion and politics, as earlier mentioned.
And after 300 years of dominance since the scientific revolution and the age of the Enlightenment, humanism, which sanctifies human life, has given rise to hedonic psychology, the economy of happiness, and experience-led design. We live in an era where well-being, the safekeeping, and the evolution of the human mind has become our primary focus. In this context, if architecture is to be the driving force behind the experience, then what is the architectural site? We argue in some way that the human mind is actually the ultimate architectural site, and therefore site research should be focused on the observation of how we perceive and how we experience and how we consequently behave. The conclusion is that experience is the most fundamental purpose for architecture and that the mind is the ultimate architectural site.
But this, of course, comes with its own problematics, because we do not like to be lumped together, assuming that we all have the same experience of the world. We like to think that we are deeply unique and different from each other. However, the news is that at a very basic level, experience is universal. This is, and again, I'm borrowing Oljati's term, has this great term that is subjective universality. This term frees us from having to deal with objective facts in order to design for everybody, but actually things would not need to be measurable in order to become universal. And therefore we would be able to work with objective notions in order to design architecture that is going to be inhabited by many people without having to understand, in particular, each of those subjects. This point is now being addressed very much by psychology and neuroscience, hot topics. But actually 2 centuries ago, it was suggested by architects. Most of the theories have been scientifically debunked. However, their intuitions remain highly relevant, we believe. But well, it doesn't matter who said it first. What matters is that they seem to be right, or we are interested in working with that idea. And yet, regardless of our raising awareness for the importance of experience, we still spend our days between white walls and plastic parquet floors, mute spaces that rely on furniture to gain character, and we wonder, how did we end up here? Yet what most people is concerned with today is how we ended up here. Here, meaning our virtual worlds. This is what really concerns us. It's really bad for us. People rightfully see it as a threat, and we understand why. However, what reality are we really talking about? This one. When we turned to some theorists, and we turn especially to Robin Evans, who is a great inspiration for us, and he instead blames our current reality, or more precisely architecture, or even more precisely modern architecture, or even more precisely we would say pseudo-modern architecture, for our current situation. We believe that somewhere within the excitement of the early days of TV, we gave center stage to gadgets, and our main source of narrative nourishment, socializing and understanding each other. While our homes became completely devoid of all narrative devices, and more importantly, extremely private and individual. Quoting again Robin Evans, he goes as far as to say that the cumulative effect of architecture during the last 2 centuries has been like that of a general lobotomy performed on society at large, obliterating vast areas of social experience. And he is in particularly here talking about the transition from the matrix of interconnected rooms to architecture or rooms behind a corridor, rooms being a dead end with a single door where we have our private lives. So we would like to highlight this issue, social experience, and how perhaps the architecture of the corridor is what has led us to technology in order to look for those social experiences. And that's where those social experiences are currently located. Our point is that perhaps instead of complaining, it's time to acknowledge that the fact that we have turned to our devices in search for what architecture lacks to offer might mean that perhaps technology is not just the one to blame, but also architecture and our highly individually focused society. We think that we must accept what is only hand in hand with technology, our only way to move forward. And we believe that a new kind of architecture will emerge from the blending of the different realms in which we today dwell, Fueled by experience as purpose, this architecture calls for a new form of practice that recognizes human cognition and perception and takes responsibility for how the rooms we inhabit, whether they are physical, virtual, or a mixture of the two, shape our lives in the most fundamental of ways.
But however, our approach to the virtual comes from a place of pure love and admiration for architectural history, and in fact comes from within the long tradition of spatial augmentation in architecture. One could go as far as to say that the cave paintings being the first form of virtual reality. But we find the frescoes to be the most true kind of attempt for virtual immersion, especially during the Renaissance, coinciding with the discovery of perspective. And this is something that we've explored in many of our projects in all sorts of different forms and ways, as was kind of indicated in the introduction. One of the first kind of experiments we did in the kind of power of the virtual surface was in this stage designed for a music festival in the outskirts of Bangkok in Thailand, where this super thin steel structure, which really almost doesn't exist visually, holds up these, again, millimeter thick surfaces with digitally printed fabrics that carries motifs reminiscent of these incredible temporary opera stages that you see across southern China and Southeast Asia that are incredibly visually intense and carry a lot of information in these very thin virtual surfaces. Just like we think that our final stage actually did. It's almost non-existent physically, but virtually it carries a lot. Similarly, we kind of expressed this in both built form and also in more temporary examples, such as this design for a mural for the Royal Institute of British Architects in London, who asked us to design specifically a virtual surface. That's not what the brief was, but which kind of somehow mirrored or kind of explored what their actual facade shows. So we took that to heart and kind of looked at the proposals of buildings that were not a part of, or they were part of the competition but didn't win, and took them through this kind of filter where we kind of imagine what they might have been, hung in this very large, again, millimeter thick surface.
So our point with this is to explain how the virtual is not just digital. The virtual exists in many formats. However, this is our first project addressing actually the virtual through the digital, the glass chain. That was a direct reaction to this history, using, instead of a print or egg and pigment like in the frescoes, we were using, in this case, printed glass. We reflected on the way in which glass has become the principal purveyor of narrative in the past decades, or even in the past years. But actually, we realized in looking at these devices how the frame works strongly against immersion. The issue of the frame is one that was deeply explored in architecture, especially during the Rococo, where figures would escape the frame and try to create this blend in between different realms. So we find ourselves dealing with this very same issue of, and more with the new devices, this blending is becoming more and more an actual thing. However, this is something that was not possible when dealing with moving image, and characters were basically forever stuck inside the box. But in our case, combining different ways of accessing virtual realities, such as the printed glass, with a virtual reality experience, we could explore the material approach to virtual reality using new fabrication technologies, but also the importance of the material in this case was also that we were kind of paying a tribute to the 20th century movement of German Expressionism. Back then, it was envisioned that glass would be the colorful and fluid material that would bring hope into post-war Europe. So you have here the 1920s envisioning glass being used in this way. However, what they could not imagine back then is what glass would actually perform and become, in the form of lenses or in the form of interfaces, the portal to whole new worlds and give three-dimensionality for the virtual plane. So in this project, we were particularly commissioned by a facade company that asked us to work with their glass material. And that's what prompted us into this journey of really exploring what is glass, what does it mean to create this intersection in between the physical and the virtual, and the haptic and the visual experiences of the world.
So working with this line of work, we have inevitably exposed our daily routines to the intersection of current VR technologies with everyday life and the spatial requirements that those three-dimensional virtual lives require. And increasingly, many homes starts to look like this, and the kind of requirements on specific kind of living rooms, etc., changes completely. And as this kind of the screen or the monitor turns into something that we actually interact with our entire body. And this is something that not just on a kind of cultural level, but on a very real level, we think that, we will see even developers start to kind of question these things. So we explored this in a project that was more a kind of article, a speculative project called the Non-Speculative VR House, where the immersive internet wants square meters. And this is something that conflicts with the ever-shrinking private cubicles in which we live. We find ourselves moving through furniture to be able to travel into the pixel-based environments we or others create. We describe in detail where we are to others who are sitting just next to us, but in a completely different place. What kind of life is this? And more directly, how do we transform these types of spaces we live in today?
Now that our virtual lives jumped out of the screen and allow us to explore in all directions, the only thing stopping us seems to be real estate. We revised Wittgenstein's quote, that some of you might recognize, to something more along the lines of the limits of my property are the limits of my world, and all I know is what I have a square meterage for. And this brings us to maybe one of the series of propositions that we have been writing, of which you will hear more in a moment. That is that the virtual will challenge us to reinvent and overcome the current notion of property. Our students have also been researching this issue and how the status quo of domestic architecture might be challenged by new ways of life and desires. And we ourselves explored this in another project that was exhibited last summer in Vienna, when we looked at the intersection of the home and the digital, in this case from the perspective of smart devices. So we became very interested in how the devices that are stepping into our homes with a strong presence do have a voice, but they do not have a body. And we easily accept them as someone we share our homes with, yet they are highly abstract objects, and therefore their disembodied voice has highlighted the urge for a face, for an interface to these machines. So when we look at the different ones, we can see that the different versions have changed in shape and in form. But however, something interesting is starting to happen. We want to introduce this project that is done by Cynthia Breezel, who has developed Jibo, which is this little robot who actually, with just a few joints, can move and express, have some quite deep expression with these very simple movements, and therefore it's sold as a very social robot and someone that becomes part of your family, and all these things. What is important is that suddenly that voice, that abstract voice, is embodying a character. So how has architecture done this? And I know this is a very obvious connection, or like a very straightforward thing to look at, but architecture actually has historically been really good at embodying abstract notions. And in this case, we are referring to embodying what a building is doing structurally. That is something quite abstract, right? That we all feel gravity, but it's not so obvious how buildings are dealing with gravity. So architecture has been incredible at giving it different expressions when a column is having a hard time or is very graciously keeping up that building. And Wolfling actually writes about this in the 19th century. He's one of those that we were talking about, who speaks about how we empathize with buildings depending on what they are doing, and how we might find unpleasing or uneasy to look at structures that are having a hard time. Our students have been doing a lot of virtual explorations that can be related to this. You will see in a moment also this very Wolfling-inspired figures appearing in the landscape, holding structures, doing lots of acrobatics, whilst in other areas they are taking it a lot easier. So our students are taking these notions into the building of virtual worlds where there is actually no gravity, but in a way our embodied experience of gravity is brought to virtual realms to create this perhaps more empathetic relation to the buildings, enclosures, or structures we virtually inhabit. And this is something also that we were looking at in this exhibition in Vienna. We were particularly interested in creating a series of components that would give parts of the home sort of affordances, or like you would almost have like a series of handshakes or ways of relating to the home. And we had one of these robots that was going around, and we literally smacked a face on it, and then it became the pet of the show. So here you see how it was quite interesting also that not on our initiative, but actually the curators decided to document the show with a point cloud, which again for us was really exciting because it's like that's all you need to take away from this show. All the material is zero thickness, right? All the content of the show can be captured by a point cloud. And then some of these architectural elements were very, very historically inspired, and but then they were also taking on parts of the home that invite the body to interact with them, are actually affordances like door handles or buttons or regulators, or all kind of drawers, handles for drawers, and so on, as you see in here, or columns that change expression as you move around them. However, we were not the first ones to consider the virtual home.
Yeah, one thing that's very interesting is this competition that was announced in 1997 in Any magazine on the virtual house. And this was, of course, before we had this piece of furniture on our face in schools like this or in our homes, where 6 architects were invited, and probably the most famous proposal was the one by Peter Eisenman that has constantly been seen in all sorts of ways. But the most interesting to us, I think, is surprisingly the Herzog and de Meuron proposal, which was very radical. And the proposal existed purely on the internet and articulated the link between the virtual and the physical with great clarity. So the virtual world is a world of pure imagination, but its starting point is always the material, physical worlds that form the basis of our existence.
This is Herzog and de Meuron saying that against
all
odds.
Yeah. What they point to is that the semiotics and the symbolic connection between the physical and the virtual, and these are kind of, the way that if someone works within a digital realm, you constantly kind of interact with these kind of objects that signifies links to the physical, although they are, of course, completely digital, and become meaningful through virtual augmented experiences. And this will change as the virtual move more and more and will become more and more signified, not just the signifier. But meanwhile, we are dealing with the issue of transforming from the singularity and establishing reality to a multiple set of realms where the value systems are conflicting.
So also, we live in these worlds now where suddenly, in terms of processing power, gold is much cheaper to do than dirt. So what is valuable? And that brings us to this next question, which is another topic that we are exploring in relation to the virtual, in relation to the home, and in relation to the issue of property and value, therefore value. So if gold is much cheaper than dirt, what do we value in virtual spaces? Well, here is the most expensive building you can buy online. It is $4,869.
It has dropped by $1,000.
It has come down. It's cheaper now. But we're actually very happy to find out because it's one of our favorite buildings, Garnier Opera. And maybe in this context, you all would understand the value of this model when I show you this, because it's not a 3D scan and it's fully modeled. Every detail is a perfect mesh where the mapping of your material is going to fit perfectly and you're not going to have any weird mappings going on, and you will not have to fix the widgets. So that is a way in which we understand value. However, the general public does not understand it as such yet. Someone that is not working with this does not understand why this would be more or less valuable. But then we see other examples that are actually much more interesting. This is a very simple model of a virgin. I kind of have the suspicion that it's done by someone from Spain, because I'm from there maybe, and I think someone would be capable of doing this. So this one is also a fairly good model. However, it's clearly it's a 3D scan. It's not modeled, so you would have mapping issues and so on. But then they post this picture. This is in the site where you buy the model. So someone went and made a physical model to 3D scan it so that they could make the digital model. And of course, this raises the value a lot in terms of the effort that went into making it. At least so we think is maybe what makes it worth $1,000 and not 20. And this brings us to a notion that we are really interested in, that maybe some of you are familiar with, but in case you're not, we will describe, is effort heuristic, which is the definition of the mental rule of thumb that we use when we are trying to determine the worth of an object based on the perceived amount of effort that went into producing it. So I see something, I understand how it is done, and therefore I can tell how valuable it is. The conflict is that when people look at 3D models, they probably would think that they are worth nothing. So we really wanted to address the question of like, how is this now? And how might this issue evolve of assigning value to craft?
Yeah, one of the classic examples from the Kruger study when the futuristic was kind of announced is they were asked subjects to read a poem, and half of the test group, they said the poem took 5 minutes to write, and the other group, they said it took 4 hours to write. And naturally, the ones who assumed that it took longer to write appreciated the poem more, although it's exactly the same, and both numbers were incorrect. This is something that we explored in an exhibition at in Stockholm at Arctis called Value in the Virtual, where we really question these kind of issues that we think is very important.
And the curator of the show is James Taylor Foster, who lectured here and who you saw before having a great time with the VR headset outdoors.
So the question is, what is value of virtual architecture, if at all, if there is any? And in order to kind of answer this, we needed to really ask ourselves, what is the value of physical architecture, and how do we even understand these concepts? In order to do that, we developed this kind of quite simple chart in order to kind of establish the core values according to us. And starting from the top, from these 8 values, we have the value of scale, which is of course a very important one. If a building is the 10 square meters, a little hut somewhere, or if it's the size of an airport terminal. The value of location, if the building is in the North Pole or if it's in central London, of course, distinguish the value. The value of function, if it's a building for a prison or if it's a building for a kindergarten, also changes the value. The material value, is it built out of gold or is it built out of mud and horsehair? The value of energy, is it how much energy went into constructing the building and how much went into running the building on a daily basis? And then, of course, we get to kind of some issues that are a little bit more difficult to kind of distinguish. So the value of comfort, how good it makes us feel on a physiological level. And then it gets really complex, the value of meaning. Of course, you see often quite buildings that are materially not so valuable, but culturally in the place, they're incredibly valuable. And finally, the value of aesthetics, even more difficult. And of course, all of these are subject to financial value, but we quickly kind of established this, that the last 3 and really the last 2 are the ones that cannot be measured, and therefore the ones that are really the only ones that are transferable as values when we talk about virtual architecture.
But also the ones that we are, I think all of us are truly scared about in terms of working with them. Who wants to go with meaning and aesthetics in a way that would be measurable? So this took us to develop a series of scenarios that led to a series of propositions. And I'm just going to take you through them. Proposition number 1 is that virtual content will radically alter the value of architecture, and that the limitations that define our physical environment, such as gravity, light, material resources, are of no concern in virtual worlds. And as such, fundamental assumptions of what and how and why and for whom architects design will have to be recast. Values will be both gained and lost in the transition to the virtual. Just as the elevator allowed and then encouraged us to dwell higher above the ground, new spatial scenarios will lead to different patterns of life, and spatial qualities yet to be imagined will change the way in which we value our environments. Virtual worlds will intensify our interest and appreciation of physical environments. They are an invention of the physical, and they rely on our haptic knowledge, on our haptic understanding of the world. In a similar way to how fiction shapes our lives, simulated reality will intensify our interest in and care towards the physical world. Architecture will be appreciated by the spatial experience it provides. Virtual environments will have the capacity to shape, lift, suppress, and influence us. Architecture in the virtual will be able to change at the speed of thought, and being freed from its primary role as shelter will lead with experience as purpose. Spatial experiences will become increasingly specific and tailored to its dwellers. Redecorating your virtual home will be as simple as changing clothes, and rapid spatial customization will increase demand for content and objects in the virtual marketplace. Planetary scale virtual worlds will coexist with their physical counterparts. The future internet will carry a persistent map of the entire physical world. Virtual worlds will coexist and interact with this map, allowing any virtual object or user to be positioned between layers within millimeter precision. Peripheral attention will broaden from objects and faces to facades and streets. Physical architecture is largely static, and as a result, peripheral to our perception of everyday lived experience. However, virtual architecture has the potential to be as interactive as human beings are with one another. Virtual craftsmanship will gain appreciation as virtual worlds become the norm, and digital craftsmanships will become mainstream. The intangible will carry the same value as tangible objects today do. Social appreciation will manifest visually as embellishments to our attire and environments. In virtual worlds, an evolved form of social media will be tethered to our avatars. Social interactions will become intensely spatial experiences. And lastly, attire and architecture will blend into a continuous extension of the self. Architecture provides a format for everyday life, but it remains peripheral to our lived experience. As inhabitable virtual environments become the norm, the environments that we shape will shape us wholly in return.
So our exhibition at Arctis, as you might have seen if you were here at James' lecture, took place in this gallery where all of these environments were chosen from Stockholm to kind of create a narrative base and organized, as you can see here. And some of the environments that we chose to work with is, for instance, the kind of ubiquitous or the standard, slightly luxurious Stockholm home that we can think of the home as a kind of isolation chamber, which in the age of the virtual becomes the ultimate communication chamber, where we can here see the communication being visibly augmented, these golden clouds emerging from the router. Other spaces, such as the Stureplan in Stockholm, which is a kind of place of high commerce, very elitist, becomes this sort of avatar shop where the skins and the attributes of your avatars can be bought not inside of the building, but even outside. Another space we worked with is this incredible mural by Siri Derket, a pioneering feminist, who created this mural, which is in material terms incredibly simple. It's just sandblasted concrete, but it has a lot of meaning, value in its meaning. So we created this big mural where from the left we can see the original and towards the right we can see it fully augmented, where in material terms it becomes three-dimensional, which of course is of, let's say, higher value. And these sandblasted scores gets filled with these golden threads, again kind of pointing to the material value.
However, arguably, it loses artistic value by becoming figurative rather than abstract.
And another space which is very interesting in material values is the Gilded Hall in the Stockholm City Hall, which is incredibly completely covered in gold mosaic, and it carries these narratives of Swedish national heroes and national pride. And we would then question this in a kind of augmented future architecture. Perhaps these motifs can change by the day and instead kind of signify the success of mobile games or Wi-Fi itself, or even the incredible creation of Wikipedia. It took place in this gallery Boxen at Arctis, which is a new building built inside of the existing gallery space. And it's beautifully laid out by the Lindbratgård as being two perfect squares. So our areas to be created were laid out like this, on top of a kind of abstracted carpet design, which we created, where we can see the center point being what we call 100% virtuality, and gradually going out to normality towards the side where we can recognize a more normal carpet. And kind of fragments of these floors were then also created in these kind of runners that ran over the entire floor. Here you can get a sense of the scale of the carpet. And then similarly to the festival project we showed you in the beginning, they were then mounted on these incredibly simple, cheap scaffolding structure, where, of course, they don't really have much material value, but they then hold these, again, millimeter-thick virtual surfaces that carried the narratives that we were just explaining.
And altogether, the space tells the story of how our cities and buildings might exist in a future where the world will be understood as a blank canvas for experimentation, where worlds will collide, mix, and clash, challenging us and our reality to unimaginable extents. Trying to convey the sense of the multiverse that surrounds us, but the space also exists virtually in a social VR platform, where visitors from across the globe can meet each other and meet those visiting the museum. In fact, we ourselves, whilst the exhibition was running in Stockholm, we would join from our office in London and give guided tours to the visitors that were there. And it was really there where all the important questions seemed to be asked, because it brought the realization of what this might mean. Another project that we will be talking about now, lastly, is one that is about to be open in the beginning of April, that is called the Wordian Case.
So this project, takes place in the Palazzo Reale in Milan, and in one of the tapestry rooms. And what it's really looking at is kind of, again, tying this together in what we're really interested in how information can be contained in surfaces, and how this has always been the case in both furniture design and also in architecture, of course. And we see in every culture around the world the kind of attempts to get information collapsed into a different dimension and put on objects so that it can travel further. And for this, we also use this incredible invention which transformed the world completely, the Wordian case, named after its inventor, which is also a way to contain information, and in this case, living plant matter, and let it travel as far as possible. Similar to what we see in what we might refer to as an HDRI map that kind of collapses the three-dimensionality of a space onto the surface of a sphere. So the case that we created is this large sculpture. These are renderings. So it will look something similar to this, done in a material called Alcantara, which you normally find in kind of cars, where we create an artificial mirror. It's not actually a mirror. It's a printed mirror of a virtual existence where we can see these characters roaming around inside the tapestry rooms, and they're only really accessible through this virtual plane where their existence has been kind of collapsed.
And these characters are actually, they are called the Argonauts. They are characters that we took from the tapestries around the room. The tapestries are communicating the myth of Jason, which I am not going to attempt to tell because it's very complex, where these Argonauts come with him. So we sort of took them out of the tapestries and into the room. However, you only perceive them through the illusory reflections that are forever captured statically in the prints that create this huge Wordian case that we have created. And then you step into the virtual world through VR lenses. And in there, the characters are there with you. And once you come out, you will have this collapsed hybrid understanding of what that space was wholly, by having the physical experience, the virtual experience in the tapestries, the virtual experience in the case, and the virtual experience through the lenses. And all of those together will construct a memory in your mind. And that is the way in which we are trying to practice. So we would like, this concludes with our most recent addition to our proposition, which is what Fredrik was just saying, that information looks for the most appropriate language in which to be written and adapts to it as a means to travel as far as it can. This makes us think that the virtual will inspire a new form of visual communication, and that might mean that architecture possibly will become a language that we speak with in a non-symbolic way, but in a literal sense.
And finally, we would just like to recommend, if anyone is interested, kind of deep dive in some of these topics we talked about. Just 2 weeks ago, we organized a full day symposium at the Architectural Association on the architecture of the immersive internet, which is available online. Yeah. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Oh, we should have.
How do you answer?
It's time for questions.
Sure. Yeah.
I have a first question. It's in a way, it's not about color. It's not about patterns. It's not, but it's more about excess. The use of excessive. Can you maybe comment on this? Why the virtual has to be colorful? Or is there a kind of straightforward answer to this in the first place?
I mean, this is obviously something, on first encounter of what we do, it's quite striking. In our, as Johan said, we were based in Bangkok for 5 years, which is where many of our kind of ideas formed, let's say, and it's a world very different from the ones that we come from. But I think, especially from the perspective of architects, there's always this kind of link between the physical effort of materializing architecture and then what it can realize. And obviously, in the last 100 years or so, we have seen a kind of rationalization of that process, where it seems excessive if it doesn't, to build something that is purely there to be experienced. Of course, you looked at architectural history, and that has never been something questioned. It's something we questioned in the last 100 years. And of course, as you saw in this very short introduction in the beginning, we also, we build houses, we do interiors, we do competitions for big public buildings, etc. But decided to focus on kind of our ideas of the virtual here. And we just see that we really have to break free from this notion of the material value of building architecture and what's worthy or what's interesting to experience. Because definitely that link is super strong and in many ways quite unproductive, we think. So we have tried to kind of break free in that sense and kind of really take it to the far extreme to see really what is the quality to be experienced. Yeah.
We also find in very direct terms that when you go somewhere, I don't know, we're very influenced by Islamic architecture. I'm from Spain, and that is just what I saw. And it fulfills, it has a meditative quality that allows you to organize thoughts. This might be a little bit weird to formulate it, but it somehow, we did a test with the glass chain sculpture. We showed you only the colorful side. I think we didn't show in this presentation the other side is completely white, and you only look at the joints, right? With this, I'm not saying that it needs to be entertainment. However, we find that visual intricacy has a psychological effect on the fact that you have somewhere to rest the eye, in the same way that looking at a tree does. So perhaps we personally feel inclined to the use of polychromy, to the use of intricate form, and to the use of ornamentation when we work. It's just our home is full of things as well. So it seems to be what pleases our eye.
And we can add just one thing as the research we're doing at the moment we showed you a little bit, but the influence of the television on architecture. And we're kind of looking for the traces of how the television as a virtual media changed architecture. And we think it's pretty telling that you never really ask. You look at a film and you say, like, this was super expensive to make, I don't like it. The billions that goes into making films, so we never question, we don't value them as such, we don't see the mechanics of it, and we pay for our films, and so we kind of think that the links are so muddled with in architecture, and we kind of trying to break them free. Yeah.
Any more question? Oh.
Thank you very much. My question is like this. Does time matter much in virtual space?
Time.
Time. Does it? It's a value, and how easy it is to recreate?
How long it takes to do something?
No, I mean really time as a dimension, a substance.
How much?
What is value in virtual world? And does it matter for you in your experience, in your practice, this dimension? Do you forget about time while creating all these buildings, or time is the thing which is more or less important here?
Time. Right.
Time as substance, yeah, because physical in physical world, time matters. Buildings are just
Take time. Yeah.
became worse and so on.
That's really an interesting question, because of course time is one of the parameters which makes it different. Because we can, both in the effort that it goes into creating something, but also in how fast you can change something, which of course architecture being one of the slowest forms of creation that humans have ever engaged in. Architecture is defined completely by time. But where if we now have the ability to not just experience, but potentially soon in the future to partially live in virtual architecture, then it can change as fast as what changes on the screen of your phone. So it's a question that is really difficult to grapple. It's almost something that has to be experienced, and we have never experienced it. Although we are architects that engages with this, we work with this, I would say that probably less than 5% of our working time is actually really either being inside this kind of virtual stuff, or even working like that. I think it may be more interesting to think about the way that architecture is actually created and how much virtual architecture is created before a real building is created. If you consider a drawing or a model or a film or a photograph of a model being also virtual. Of course, always having in mind that there's going to be a physical building in the end, which changes everything. But I mean, definitely time is the parameter that makes it different. So it's a really good observation, but I don't think we have a very clear answer.
Yeah. There is also the lack of the possible choosing of not having a son, right? And what that might mean. I mean, that's like, oh my God, what do we do, right? Yeah. But it is, it's quite interesting, because it starts making you think that there is a time that is not the time on our watches, but the time we live by, and that perhaps that is the time we might move to. And we already always talk about, like, when we have just experiences in the physical, right? Like, oh my God, the time flew, or time went so slow. Maybe it's not that time flew, or that maybe it actually went slower, and maybe it actually goes faster. And I mean that maybe what our watches are saying is just wrong. So it's quite interesting, and just a very silly anecdote, but there is a VR game where the pace at which you move dictates the pace at which the world moves. And if you spend some time there, you come out and you literally think that if you drop your glass but you stop, the glass is not going to fall. And so you realize how flexible the mind is at maybe adjusting to new, even time environments. So it gets addictive in that sense. I'm not addicted, I haven't spent that much time in it, but it does get incredibly, or like you realize that you have superpowers that you didn't know you had to change the way in which, to become a different animal, basically.
But on that point also, I think on the point of attention is something to take in mind. Time is already, we talk about the attention economy today, and the power that just through this little screen we hold in our hands has the power to take our time that we might spend on doing other things. Once we are actually in that space, the kind of ability of the mediator of the platform that you're in, be it an enormous social media company in California or whatever, will likely have the possibility to control your attention across time in ways we can't even imagine. I mean, I think it's really important that not just architects, is constantly what we say, but to be really ready for this and not just be someone standing by and seeing how it happens, but in being engaged both as creators but even politically, and making sure that it doesn't become a sort of endless trap of time that we're not control of.
Because otherwise it will be shitstorm coming our way, possibly.
More questions?
Long answers we have in case there is no more questions.
I see your work really strongly connected to the context it's being put at or settled. True. And I'm wondering how the process of selecting the pivot points or the central parts of what you start reflecting on is being processed or made, or how do you make this selection? And then going further from there, if you would have to do that in Estonia, would you already know what would be the topic to discover?
Mm-hmm. You want the information. It's such a nice question because, I mean, firstly, what you say that like we always work with context. We get hyper-contextual. And the more you work in the virtual, at least for us, the more interested you become in the physical world. So this myth that, oh my God, we're all going to go into our screens and we're never going to care for the physical world. No way. I mean, you become in materials, when we were doing these mosaic walls, like I wanted to do mosaic myself to really understand how that works and how can I then start to transform it, what are the laws of it. And without the physical, there would be no inspiration. In the same way as in the beginning, architecture carried acanthus leaves from what they had around, trees, right? So that is a very important point that maybe we didn't make, and thanks for asking that, because the virtual is only going to make us more and more interested in the physical world around us. And that's why every virtual world we create is so deeply connected to its context.
And also with our built work. But it's interesting that you say that. I think that is probably the last thing someone would think based on, your first question on kind of how a lot of the work maybe looks. It really looks like the most anti-contextual type of architecture you can come across. I think it's something that maybe I'm reading into this too much. But also, our built work has always, like the brick vault houses that you saw in the beginning, which is a house that should be finishing in a few months, is specifically has these qualities from what is offered not just in Spain, but specifically in the city.
In terms of construction.
Yeah.
Then in what would we do in Estonia? Well, we are going to do it very soon. And it has started, the reason why we're lecturing mainly about the domestic realm and how the virtual is manifesting into the home is the topic that we will be exploring. However, it is our first time in Estonia, and tomorrow will be the first time that we're visiting the venue. So we've been really holding back, actually, on work until this very moment in terms of, we had rough ideas and have started the broad research, because it's always those phrases, they have like a broad argument and then a particular response. So it's, that's the reason why we really wanted to come here as well. We don't know it, and it's been just a few hours. We shouldn't mention.
You don't know what you're talking about, otherwise.
We are part of the Italian Architecture Biennale, which will take place in September of this year here.
And we're exploring specifically the role of domesticity when the screen increasingly becomes immersive. And we think it's also interesting to explore that here, which Estonia might be really the kind of incredible invitation of new technology, be like kind of one of the pioneering places in the world to see really what is this new home going to be like, which we will be living in probably within the next 5 or 10 years. Yeah.
However, the theme of the Biennale is beauty, one of those muddy themes which we enjoy as well. So we will be somehow tackling that as well through the project. Okay. more questions?
More questions? If not, I have one. Last question, really.
I will answer short now.
Okay, I mean, it's a super simple question. I mean, you're very deep into virtual reality, and it seems like when virtual reality, at least as much as I can tell, started, it was always this promise of you really being immersed. And the second kind of promise was that it's interactive. Like your bodily movement actually helps to influence what's happening in space around you. So my kind of obvious kind of question or thing that comes to my mind is question of authorship. If this virtual reality is something that is kind of staged and kind of created and as a kind of visual to be enjoyed and kind of gone through, or like you go through it as a kind of immersive space, or if it's actually something that you can create as a kind of visitor as well, you being the one that actually creates this virtual environment, or is this something that's still pretty much kind of like a mystery to solve, or are there clues of how the authorship from you guys can shift to the person visiting the exhibition?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because I think the internet has prepared us a little bit for what this new world is going to be like. And we also find the best way to describe really what this future might be like. We find it quite uninteresting to consider these bulky things we put on our faces in our homes that are disconnected. When they get connected, just like the computer, when we had computers unconnected in our homes, didn't really have an influence. As soon as they became connected, it changed everything. So in that regard, like we can think of the internet like a very, very detailed map of a continent. Like we know a lot through this map, but we've never really been to this continent. And through this, what we refer to as the immersive internet, we're actually going to really go there. So I think we've started to be prepared a little bit of this changing notions of authorship. And that might be like most shocking for architects, because architecture has been something, although most buildings built in the world are not built, don't have architects involved. But of course, architects have this potential or ability to see, you know, well-crafted buildings by architects being really the author is an important thing. And it will be really, really shocking for architects. You know, there's constantly this discussion, are we going to live in some sort of Spotify or Netflix of buildings where you swipe to the next building if you don't like it? Certainly there's going to be either a big split in the architecture field in the next 20 or 30 years, or architects will be increasingly remaining doing the physical parts of architecture, and what is now the gaming world, it's already splitting, the gaming world is splitting apart partially, and there will be a whole other disciplines that does the virtual parts of building. And in that case, maybe architects can save themselves from this crisis of authorship. Mm-hmm. But we can already, and if someone is really curious, if you go into these social VR platforms where you actually bring your avatar, everyone talks about what I have created. Look at what I've made, look at me, my avatar, or people bring in their what they have created, a city or an entire world, and you visit someone's place and you're very aware that you're in their place. But it changes then every minute, every 2 minutes, every day. Yeah.
And it gets really, really intimate, because what you have made, usually, at least as of now, is like you have made every single pixel of it. And I had a very intimate experience with someone in VR where I was wearing an avatar that I just chose randomly. And a guy came up to me and told me that he had made me. And that was just, I almost fell to the ground, like, of course.
And by saying what this avatar looked like, it was a bald, slightly overweight white male. Yeah.
Without a shirt. So on that note.
On that note, thank you very much again.
Thank you so much.